September 14, 1945. 6:47 a.m. Farmland outside Norwich, Norfolk. The truck stopped at the edge of a field that stretched toward the horizon in perfect parallel lines, wheat stubble glowing gold in the early light, hedgerows thick with blackberries, a sky so vast and unmarred by smoke or aircraft that it felt almost obscene. 23 German prisoners sat in the truck bed, their hands calloused from weeks of camp labor, their minds still adjusting to the rhythm of captivity. Wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. They had been told they were being assigned to agricultural work on British farms, that they would help with the harvest, that the labor would be supervised but fair. They expected fields worked by hand, horses pulling plows, the kind of subsistence farming they had known in Germany before the war consumed everything. What they saw instead made no sense. 3 tractors. Parked in a neat row beside a stone barn, painted green, their metal sides gleaming in the morning sun. Not old, not broken, not salvaged from wreckage. New. Or near enough. Functional. Abundant. 3 tractors for one farm, sitting idle as if machinery were so common it could be spared. Klaus Weber, 32, a former farm laborer from East Prussia, stood and stared. He had spent his childhood behind a plow pulled by 2 exhausted horses. He had worked soil by hand, harvested grain with a scythe, lived in a world where a single tractor was a luxury reserved for the wealthiest estates. And here, in the country he had been taught was starving, collapsing, bankrupt by war, 3 tractors. On one farm. Waiting. The British corporal supervising the work detail noticed Klaus staring. Problem? He asked in passable German. Klaus shook his head. Then stopped. How many farms does this man own? The corporal looked confused. Just the one. 200 acres. Average size for Norfolk. And he has 3 tractors. One for plowing, one for harvesting, one for repairs. Standard equipment. Klaus sat back down slowly, his mind struggling to process the contradiction. Standard equipment. 3 tractors. For one farm. In a country the propaganda had promised was dying. They had been told Britain was on the brink of collapse, cities bombed into dust, civilians starving, industry crippled by blockade. The first thing they saw was a farmer with more machinery than an entire German village had possessed before the war. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The moment held. The other prisoners climbed down from the truck, their boots crunching on gravel, their eyes scanning the farm with the same disbelief Klaus felt. Everything was intact. The barn was solid stone, its roof unbroken. The farmhouse stood 3 stories tall, windows whole, smoke rising from a chimney. Chickens wandered freely in a yard fenced with wire that was not rusted, not scavenged, just functional. A dog barked once, then settled back into the shade. This was not a nation on its knees. This was a working farm, prosperous and productive, operating with a level of efficiency and abundance that contradicted every narrative they had absorbed for 12 years. The propaganda had been explicit. Britain was weak, collapsing under the weight of total war, its people reduced to scavenging for survival while the Reich's superior organization ensured German civilians remained fed and supplied. But the evidence before them suggested otherwise. The tractors gleamed. The fields were cultivated with precision. The barn held equipment, plows, harrows, seeders, organized and maintained. This was not desperation. This was surplus. The farmer emerged from the house, a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, wearing coveralls and boots caked with mud. He walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned what he stood on and knew its value. He nodded to the corporal, glanced at the prisoners, and said in English, "Right. Let's get to work then." The corporal translated. The prisoners followed the farmer to the field, where he demonstrated what needed to be done, loading harvested wheat onto a trailer pulled by, of course, one of the tractors. The work was straightforward, physical but not punishing. The farmer worked alongside them, hauling bales with the same rhythm, pausing to drink water from a canteen he passed around without hesitation. When Klaus fumbled a bale and it split open, the farmer shrugged, showed him how to tie it properly, and moved on. No anger. No punishment. Just correction. At midday, the farmer's wife appeared with lunch, thick sandwiches, hard-boiled eggs, apples, tea in a thermos. She set the basket on the trailer, smiled briefly, and returned to the house. The prisoners ate in silence, chewing bread that tasted better than anything they had eaten in months, trying to reconcile the abundance with the narrative they had been fed. Klaus wrote that evening in a notebook issued by the Red Cross, "The farmer has 3 tractors. His wife brought us sandwiches with real butter. The dog is fat. I was told Britain was starving. I was told the war had destroyed them. I do not know what to believe anymore. Klaus Weber had been a farm laborer on an estate in East Prussia before the war. Born into poverty, he had worked the land since childhood, learning to coax crops from soil that was marginal at best, to maximize every resource, to accept that scarcity was the natural order of things. When the war began, he had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht, assigned to a supply battalion responsible for requisitioning food from occupied territories. He had seen firsthand how the Reich fed its armies by stripping conquered lands, how grain was taken from Polish farmers at gunpoint, how livestock was slaughtered to feed German soldiers while local populations starved. He had been captured in April 1945, during the final collapse, his unit surrendering to British forces near Hamburg. The British had processed him with bureaucratic efficiency, loaded him onto ships crossing the Channel, and transported him to a camp in East Anglia where prisoners were housed in Nissen huts and assigned to agricultural labor programs designed to address Britain's post-war labor shortage. The journey to England had taken 3 days. The ferry from Cuxhaven to Harwich was crowded, the prisoners packed into holds that smelled of diesel and unwashed bodies. Klaus had expected brutality, guards who beat stragglers, rations withheld as punishment, the casual cruelty that war normalized. Instead, he received tin bowls of stew, weak but edible, and was allowed on deck for fresh air during the crossing. When they docked, British soldiers directed them to trains with the same impersonal efficiency they applied to cargo. No malice, no warmth, just logistics. The camp, when they arrived, looked like every military installation Klaus had ever seen: rows of huts, barbed wire perimeter, guard towers, parade ground. But it was clean. Organized. The barracks had beds with mattresses, blankets that were not threadbare, a stove for heat. Meals were served on schedule: porridge, bread, tea, occasionally meat or cheese. It was not generous. But it was regular. And regularity, Klaus had learned, was a form of wealth. The pivot came not in words but in objects. On his 3rd day at the farm, Klaus was assigned to repair a fence in the pasture where the farmer kept sheep. He was given tools, a hammer, nails, wire cutters, and left to work with minimal supervision. The tools were good quality, well maintained, not improvised or salvaged. When Klaus finished the repair, the farmer inspected it, nodded approval, and said, "You've done this before." "Yes. In Prussia. Before the war." "Good land there," the farmer said. "Flat. Like Norfolk." "Yes. But we had no tractors. Only horses." The farmer looked at him. "How did you manage harvest?" "By hand. With scythes. Everyone worked. Children, women, old men. It took weeks." The farmer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's hard living." Klaus nodded. It had been. It was all he had known. That evening, the farmer's wife brought dinner to the barn where the prisoners were housed during work assignments: roasted chicken, potatoes, carrots, bread. She served them as if they were laborers, not enemies, setting plates on a makeshift table and leaving without ceremony. Klaus ate slowly, savoring the chicken, the real butter on the bread, the vegetables that tasted of soil and sunlight rather than tin and desperation. "I thought we would be punished," he said to the man beside him, a former mechanic named Joseph. "I thought the British would make us suffer for losing." Joseph chewed thoughtfully. "Maybe they don't need to. Maybe they've already won so completely that punishment would be redundant." Klaus considered this. It was true. The farm's abundance was a more devastating rebuke than any cruelty could have been. It said, "You were lied to. Your leaders told you we were weak, that we were collapsing, that victory was inevitable. But here we are, prosperous, functional, so secure we can afford to feed our enemies. I was told Britain was starving," Klaus wrote. "But the farmer's wife brought us roasted chicken. I was told they were desperate. But they have tractors to spare." The propaganda was not exaggerated. It was inverted. We were the ones starving. We were the ones desperate. And they let us believe otherwise until the lie consumed us. The policy governing POW labor in Britain was pragmatic. By 1945, the country faced a severe agricultural labor shortage, millions of men still in military service, civilian workers needed for reconstruction, farms struggling to maintain production levels necessary to feed a war-weary population. German and Italian POWs, already in British custody and requiring supervision, represented a labor force that could be deployed to address the shortage while adhering to Geneva Convention requirements that prisoners be employed in non-military work and compensated appropriately. A directive from the Ministry of Agriculture, issued in June 1945, outlined the framework. Prisoners assigned to farms would work under British supervision, receive wages paid into camp accounts, and be housed either in camps or on-site accommodations depending on logistical needs. Farmers employing POW labor were required to treat them as workers rather than slaves, to provide adequate food and shelter, and to report any disciplinary issues to military authorities rather than handle them personally. Security, diplomacy, morality. The system served all three. It eased labor shortages, demonstrated Britain's adherence to international law, and maintained standards that separated captivity from cruelty. A memo stamped Ministry of Agriculture 1945, "Prisoners are workers, not property." 5 words that shaped how tens of thousands of German POWs experienced post-war Britain. The days on the farm settled into rhythms that felt almost ordinary. Wake at 6. Breakfast at the camp. Transport to the farm by 7. Work until noon, plowing fields, mending fences, loading harvested crops, maintaining equipment. Lunch brought by the farmer's wife. Afternoon work. Return to camp by 6. Dinner. Evening free time. Sleep. The labor was physical but not punishing. The British corporal who supervised the work detail enforced productivity but not through cruelty. He corrected mistakes, maintained pace, and ensured safety without rage or humiliation. The farmer treated the prisoners as employees, demonstrating tasks, answering questions through the corporal's translation, and working alongside them when necessary. Klaus was assigned to operate one of the tractors, a task that required training, trust, and the implicit acknowledgement that he was competent enough to handle valuable machinery. The farmer spent 2 days teaching him how to start the engine, control the throttle, manage the plow attachment, maintain the equipment. Klaus learned quickly. He had spent years dreaming of operating a tractor, had watched them from a distance on wealthy estates, had imagined what it would feel like to work land with machinery instead of muscle and horse. Now, as a prisoner, he was being taught to drive one. By the enemy. On a farm that had 3. The absurdity was almost unbearable. Helmut Fischer, 28, had been a mechanic in a panzer division before his capture. He had spent the war maintaining tanks, repairing engines, keeping the machinery of destruction functional. When he was assigned to the farm, he expected to be treated as unskilled labor, given menial tasks that required no expertise. Instead, the farmer asked if he knew engines. Helmut said yes. The farmer showed him a broken harvester and asked if he could fix it. Helmut examined the machine, a complex piece of equipment that combined cutting, threshing, and baling functions. The problem was a seized bearing in the drive mechanism. Helmut spent 2 days disassembling the machine, sourcing replacement parts from the farmer's workshop, and reassembling it with precision. When he finished, the harvester ran smoothly. The farmer tested it, nodded approval, and said, "Good work." Not good for a prisoner, or good despite being German. Just good work. As if nationality were irrelevant to competence. Helmut wrote that night, "I fixed a British harvester today. The farmer thanked me as if I were a colleague, not an enemy. I do not understand this war. I do not understand how the people we try to destroy can treat us as if we still have value." Ernst Becker, 35, had been a school teacher in Bavaria before the war. Conscripted in 1943, he had served in a logistics unit, managing supply routes until his capture in May 1945. He arrived at the farm expecting to be assigned grunt work, hauling bales, digging ditches, the kind of labor that required no thought and allowed no dignity. Instead, the farmer's wife asked if he could help their daughter with schoolwork. She was 12, struggling with mathematics, and needed tutoring. Ernst hesitated. He was a prisoner. Why would they trust him with their child? But the farmer's wife simply handed him a textbook and said, "1 hour after dinner. In the kitchen. She needs help with fractions." Ernst tutored the girl 3 evenings a week. She was bright, eager to learn, frustrated by concepts that felt abstract. Ernst broke them down, used apples from the orchard as visual aids, explained ratios through farm measurements. The girl understood. She smiled when she solved problems correctly. Her mother brought tea and biscuits, thanked Ernst for his time, and paid him in cigarettes, currency in the camp economy, valuable beyond their function. Ernst wrote, "I am teaching a British farmer's daughter mathematics. She called me sir today. Her mother brought me tea. I fought in a war against these people. And now I am drinking tea in their kitchen, teaching their child fractions. The cognitive dissonance is almost unbearable. But the tea was good. And the girl is learning." If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. The ideological erosion was gradual, built from accumulated contradictions. The prisoners had been taught that Britain was weak, decadent, incapable of sustaining a modern war. But the farms were prosperous. The tractors were new. The farmers worked with efficiency born of education and access to technology, not desperation. The fields yielded harvests that were measured in tons, not scraped from the margins of survival. One afternoon in October, Klaus was driving a tractor across a field when the farmer flagged him down. The farmer climbed onto the running board and pointed at the horizon. "See that farm?" he said, gesturing toward a cluster of buildings 2 miles distant. "That's my brother's. 300 acres. He's got 4 tractors." Klaus stared. 4. "And beyond that," the farmer continued, "is the Wilkinson place. 500 acres. Family's been farming there since the 1600s. They've got 6 tractors now. Bought 2 new ones this year." 6 tractors. Klaus tried to imagine owning 6 tractors and failed. It was wealth beyond comprehension, resources so abundant they seemed obscene. "How?" Klaus asked. "How do you have so much?" The farmer shrugged. "Government subsidies. Agricultural loans. Mechanization programs. We've been investing in equipment for 20 years. War slowed things, but we kept producing. Had to. Feed the country, feed the troops, feed the allies. Couldn't do that with horses." Klaus absorbed this. While Germany had been stripping occupied territories to sustain its war machine, Britain had been investing in agricultural infrastructure, mechanizing production, building systems that could sustain themselves through blockade and bombing. The propaganda had promised that Germany's superior organization would ensure victory. But Britain's actual organization, less ideological, more pragmatic, had simply worked better. "I was told you were starving," Klaus said quietly. The farmer smiled, not unkindly. "I expect you were told a lot of things." Harvest Festival came in late October, a local tradition celebrating the year's crop. The farmer invited the prisoners to attend, not as observers but as participants. They rode into the village in the back of a truck, flanked by British guards who carried no weapons and looked more bored than vigilant. The village square was decorated with bundles of wheat, pumpkins, apples arranged in pyramids. A church service was held, hymns sung in English that the prisoners did not understand but recognized as familiar melodies from their own childhoods. After the service, a communal meal, roasted pork, potatoes, bread, cider. The prisoners were given plates and invited to sit at long tables alongside British civilians, farmers, and soldiers. Klaus sat beside an elderly man who asked, through the corporal's translation, where he was from. Klaus said Prussia. The man nodded and said his son had fought there, had been killed near Königsberg in 1945. Klaus froze, uncertain how to respond. But the old man simply said, "War's a bastard, innit? Takes everyone's boys." It was not forgiveness. It was exhaustion. The recognition that grief was universal, that loss did not belong to any single side, that the war had taken more than it could ever justify. Klaus ate in silence, the pork tasting of salt and smoke, the cider sweet and strong. He looked around the square, at British civilians laughing with prisoners, at guards sharing cigarettes with the men they supervised, at a world that had decided the war was over and moved on. He thought about the 3 tractors, the roasted chicken, the farmer's daughter learning fractions. He thought about the propaganda that had promised Britain was collapsing and the reality that had revealed Britain was simply continuing. "I do not hate them," he wrote that night. "I thought I would. I thought hatred was inevitable. But I do not hate the farmer who pays me fairly, or his wife who brings tea, or the old man whose son died fighting us. I pity us. For believing the lies. For fighting a war we could not win. For sacrificing everything to a cause that was built on nothing but arrogance and lies." By 1946, the agricultural labor program had employed over 150,000 German and Italian POWs across Britain, contributing significantly to post-war food production while prisoners awaited repatriation. Many formed relationships with the families they worked for, not friendships exactly, but mutual respect built through shared labor, consistent treatment, and the slow recognition that enemies could be decent if given the structure to prove it. Klaus was repatriated in March 1947. He returned to find East Prussia under Soviet occupation, his family scattered, his farm gone. He moved west, settled in the British zone, and found work as an agricultural advisor, teaching mechanization techniques to German farmers rebuilding their operations. He wrote letters to the Norfolk farmer, sporadic at first, then regular, updates on his life, questions about farming methods, expressions of gratitude that felt inadequate but necessary. The farmer wrote back. Brief letters, mostly about weather and crops, but always signed with regards. In 1952, Klaus visited England as a tourist. He took a train to Norwich, walked to the farm, and knocked on the door. The farmer answered, older now but recognizable, and smiled. Thought you might come back someday. They walked the fields together, Klaus noting the fourth tractor parked beside the barn. The farmer explained new equipment, pointed out improvements, spoke about his daughter's progress in school. She had gone to university, was studying engineering. Klaus told him about the farms in Germany, about reconstruction efforts, about the slow process of rebuilding a country from rubble and shame. When Klaus left, the farmer gave him a gift, a small metal gear from the first tractor Klaus had learned to operate. For remembering, the farmer said. Klaus kept it on his desk for the rest of his life, a reminder that the enemy had taught him to drive a tractor, that abundance could coexist with restraint, that the measure of a nation was not its ideology but its willingness to maintain standards even when no one would fault it for cruelty. If this story has shown you that propaganda's greatest casualty is truth, subscribe and share, because the wars we remember longest are the ones where reality shattered the lies we were told. September 14, 1945. 6:47 a.m. A truck stopped at the edge of a field. 23 German prisoners expected subsistence and saw surplus instead. 3 tractors. Gleaming. Functional. Abundant. Proof that the enemy they had been taught was collapsing had simply continued, had mechanized and organized and invested while Germany had stripped and burned and lied. The propaganda had promised Britain was starving. The farmer's wife brought roasted chicken. The propaganda had promised desperation. The farmer owned 3 tractors and called it standard equipment. And in that contradiction, between the narrative they had absorbed and the reality they were living, the prisoners learned that the greatest weapon of war was not bombs or bullets but the lie that made soldiers believe they were fighting for survival when they were actually fighting for a fantasy. Klaus drove a tractor across fields that stretched to horizons unmarked by fire. He ate sandwiches with real butter. He taught a farmer's daughter fractions in a kitchen where tea was served without suspicion. And slowly, through small acts of ordinary decency repeated daily, he understood that the war had been lost not because Germany lacked strength but because it had built everything on lies. And lies, no matter how loudly repeated, could not survive contact with 3 tractors parked beside a barn, gleaming in the morning sun, waiting. The war had taught them that enemies were monsters. A British farm taught them that enemies were simply people who had organized better, lied less, and chosen to maintain standards even when employing prisoners who had tried to destroy them. The tractors gleamed. The fields produced. And the propaganda crumbled into ash.